The Dark Scrolls. In the dim recesses of forgotten vaults, where dust gathers thick upon the cracked bindings of parchment, and the air itself tastes of iron and candle smoke, the age of the Tudors lies waiting to be awakened. Their story begins not with triumphal fanfare, but with the echo of blades and the silence of a corpse left upon Bosworth Field in 1485. Richard III, last of the Plantagenets, fell among the mud and the carrion crows, and out of that carnage rose a figure whose claim was slender, whose lineage was disputed, and yet whose destiny was to found a dynasty. Henry Tudor, later Henry VII, stitched together his crown with blood, marriage, and rumor. Some contemporaries whispered that his legitimacy was weaker than the threadbare banners under which he marched, yet fortune bent in his favor. With the marriage to Elizabeth of York, the warring roses, red and white, were bound together, and a new emblem, the Tudor rose, bloomed upon the throne of England. From the first, the dynasty was not free of shadows. Henry VII was praised for prudence and condemned for avarice. Records speak of his relentless pursuit of revenue, of schemes and fines that enriched the crown, while impoverishing nobles who dared test his strength. The people admired his stability after decades of civil strife. Yet in whispers there grew tales of a sovereign whose calculating eyes could see coin where others saw loyalty. His death in 1509 passed the crown to his second son, a boy not yet 20, brimming with health, golden hair, and a promise of glory. Henry VIII entered history not as the bloated tyrant of his later years, but as the embodiment of Renaissance magnificence. Court poets described his grace in the lists, his skill in music and languages, his beauty, radiant like the very sun. Chroniclers noted his towering frame, broad shoulders, and restless ambition. In his early years, ambassadors wrote home in awe of a king who seemed destined to rival Caesar. Yet hidden within the folds of this golden image lay the seeds of excess, cruelty, and decay that would make his reign notorious. The realm he inherited was one striving toward modernity, yet shackled by medieval superstitions. The streets of London stank with refuse, and sewage poured into the Thames. Physicians prescribed ground pearls and powdered skulls for ailments, while plague and sweating sickness swept through cities like invisible armies. Noble households feasted on swan and venison, while the poor often survived on coarse bread and pottage. It was a world both luminous and grim, where the glories of courtly masks and imported silks coexisted with lice, filth, and a life expectancy crushed by disease. Into this contrast marched Henry's appetites. He consumed life with an urgency that alarmed even his closest servants. Records attest to banquets where dozens of dishes were served, where roasted peacocks arrived upon platters, gilded with their own iridescent feathers, and where minstrels drowned the groans of the king's leg ulcers with ceaseless music. Physicians were summoned not to curb his indulgence, but to ease its effects, to lance the boils, to bind the sores, to mask the smell of rot with ointments pungent enough to overpower the stench of the royal body. Yet before the fall, there was a scent. Catherine of Aragon, widow of Henry's elder brother Arthur, became his queen. Their union, at first tender, brought prestige, binding England to the mighty crown of Spain. Catherine bore him children, but one after another the infants perished. Only Mary survived. To a king obsessed with securing a male heir, this was a torment both personal and political. Here the chroniclers begin to diverge, some attributing Henry's anguish to divine displeasure, others to his own recklessness, still others whispering of curses laid upon the Tudor bloodline. From that yearning sprang the rupture that would scar England for centuries. The king's determination to set aside Catherine and wed Anne Boleyn. Anne was unlike the pliant consorts of Europe. Sharp-tongued, ambitious, and educated in the courts of Burgundy and France, she was both fascination and frustration. Accounts describe her as dark-haired, with an enigmatic allure. Some hostile pamphlets claimed she bore physical deformities, an extra finger, a protruding tooth, though such accusations may have been slander to blacken her name after her fall. What remains undeniable is the power she held over Henry, a power strong enough to sever England from Rome. The Pope refused to annul Henry's marriage, and thus the king declared himself supreme head of the Church in England. This single act unleashed a tempest. Monasteries that had stood for centuries were dissolved, their treasures confiscated, their lands parceled out to the king's allies. Monks were cast into the streets, relics smashed, shrines desecrated. To supporters, it was the birth of a new England, freed from papal corruption. To detractors, it was desecration and sacrilege, the very harbinger of divine wrath. Blood ran as both noblemen and commoners who defied the royal supremacy were executed. Among them Sir Thomas More, once the king's most trusted counsellor, beheaded for clinging to his faith. Anne's star, which had burned so brightly, collapsed into shadow. Having failed to produce a male heir, though she gave birth to Elizabeth, who would one day prove greater than any son, Anne found herself accused of adultery, incest, and treason. The charges were grotesque, involving 5 men, including her own brother. Whether true or fabricated, the verdict was swift. She knelt before a French swordsman in 1536, the blade severing her head with a single stroke. Chroniclers noted her dignity in death, her calm acceptance, as if she recognized the futility of struggle against the machinery of Tudor power. The cycle of marriage and death continued. Jane Seymour bore Henry his longed-for son, Edward, only to die days later from complications of childbirth. Anne of Cleves, brought from Germany, was dismissed as unattractive. Henry called her a Flanders mare and annulled the union within months. Catherine Howard, young and reckless, was executed for alleged infidelities. Finally came Catherine Parr, who outlived the king, tending to his failing body as it swelled with corruption, his once magnificent form reduced to a monstrous bulk, incapable of movement without mechanical contraptions to lift him. Behind the pageantry of these royal marriages, the realm suffered under the weight of tyranny. Spies whispered in taverns, informers crept through corridors, and the gallows stood ready for nobles and peasants alike. England itself seemed to shiver under the burden of fear, while the king's body decayed. His legs were wrapped in bandages soaked with herbs, his chamber reeking of putrefaction, even as minstrels continued to sing of glory. By the time of his death in 1547, Henry had transformed from a golden prince into a bloated tyrant, his legacy written as much in blood as in law. The boy who inherited the throne, Edward VI, was but 9 years old. His reign, though short, was marked by religious fervor and the tightening of Protestant reforms. He sickened and died at 15, leaving the succession in chaos. Lady Jane Grey, manipulated into claiming the crown, reigned but 9 days before being deposed by Mary, Henry's eldest daughter. Jane's execution, a teenage girl walking calmly to the block, is one of the most haunting images in Tudor memory. Mary I, determined to restore Catholicism, unleashed a storm of persecution. Nearly 300 Protestants were burned alive as heretics, earning her the epithet Bloody Mary. The smell of charred flesh mingled with the smoke of Smithfield Market, and the cries of martyrs echoed in the chronicles of the time. Her reign was short, her body weakened by phantom pregnancies and illness, but her name endured as a symbol of terror and religious zealotry. It was Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, who finally steadied the crown. Declaring herself married to her realm, she ruled as the Virgin Queen. Yet beneath her triumphant image, doubts persisted. Some claimed she concealed physical deformities. Others whispered she was not truly a woman at all, but a man disguised to preserve the line. Her use of lead-based cosmetics left her face scarred and pallid, a mask of white over rotting skin. She commanded loyalty with words that still resound. "I have the heart and stomach of a king." But she ruled from behind layers of paint and artifice, her body a canvas of decay disguised as majesty. Her reign brought relative stability, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the flowering of culture, and the beginnings of empire. Yet it was also an age of espionage, executions, and ceaseless plots. Elizabeth's refusal to name an heir kept the realm in constant suspense, while her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, languished in captivity until finally condemned and beheaded. In her death, Mary became a Catholic martyr, while Elizabeth's mask of virgin power hardened into the image that history remembers. By the dawn of the 17th century, the Tudor line had withered. Elizabeth died childless in 1603, and the crown passed to the Scottish Stuarts. But the legends of the Tudors endured. Their reign was marked by brilliance and blood, by magnificence and horror. The archives record not merely their victories, but the stench of their sickness, the screams of their victims, the strange remedies and bizarre beliefs that guided their lives. In their courts, astrologers charted the heavens to decide marriages. Physicians prescribed ground human bone to cure fevers. Nobles whispered of omens in comets and miscarriages. The Tudors were creatures of both light and shadow, their dynasty a tapestry woven of gold and gore. To peer into their age is to open a vault of contradictions, a world of radiant queens painted in poisonous white, of kings who sang madrigals even as they signed death warrants, of a people both awed and terrorized by the majesty of their rulers. These, then, are the shocking truths of the Tudors, not hidden in obscure corners, but written openly in the chronicles of their time, awaiting only the courage to read them. In the narrowing corridors of the Tudor palaces, as torchlight flickered against painted ceilings and tapestries sagged heavy with dust and smoke, the grandeur of the dynasty turned ever more suffocating. Henry VIII, once the radiant prince, had by the mid-years of his reign become a figure both magnificent and monstrous. The crown weighed heavy upon his temples, yet the appetite for dominion, for flesh, for gold, and for the obedience of souls had only grown heavier. Courtiers noted that he no longer walked with the vigor of youth, but shuffled with pain, his vast frame supported by hidden mechanisms, while beneath the silks and furs, his ulcerated legs wept with foul discharge. The smell, impossible to mask, clung to his chambers like a curse. Yet even as the king's body decayed, his demands expanded. The machinery of the realm bent to his will, driven by an engine of fear. Treason had once meant plotting against the sovereign. Under Henry, it came to mean merely displeasing him. Parliament passed statutes that mirrored the changing winds of his passions. One day an oath to papal supremacy was required. The next it was treason to remember it. Subjects whispered that even silence might condemn, for the king's spies listened at keyholes, and the scaffold at Tower Hill grew slick with blood. Among the condemned was Sir Thomas More, once Henry's most trusted humanist counsellor. More's refusal to acknowledge the king's supremacy led him to the block in 1535, where he declared himself the king's faithful servant, but God's first. The chroniclers recorded the crowd's silence, broken only by the executioner's axe. Such deaths multiplied, noblemen and commoners alike brought down by accusations that might have been rumor, slander, or truth. It scarcely mattered. Henry's word had become law, and law had become execution. The break with Rome reshaped England's soul. Monasteries, those great repositories of learning, wealth, and charity, were dissolved. Stone by stone, abbeys were torn apart, their relics smashed, their lands seized by the crown and redistributed to the new men who rose on Henry's favor. For peasants and townsfolk, the change was cataclysmic. Pilgrimages ended, saints' shrines lay desolate, and the poor who had relied on monastic charity were left adrift. Priests who clung to Rome were hanged, drawn, and quartered. Reformers who moved too far too quickly were burned. England seemed suspended between two fires, one papal, one royal, each promising salvation, and each delivering terror. The human body itself became a battlefield of faith and superstition. Physicians still clung to Galen's ancient doctrine of humors, prescribing bleeding, purging, or the application of bizarre substances. Records describe poultices of cow dung pressed to wounds, concoctions of crushed emeralds swallowed to ward off plague, and the horrifying use of human fat from executed criminals as an ointment for broken bones. Mothers whispered of charms woven from menstrual blood, while in secret, some drank from the warm veins of the condemned, believing fresh blood might drive epilepsy away. In the streets, the sick crawled to shrines with offerings, while the surgeons of Barbers' Hall sharpened their knives for amputations done without anesthesia, their patients' screams drowned only by church bells. The daily life of Tudor London was no less shocking. Chamber pots emptied from windows splashed onto cobblestones, already slick with offal from the shambles. The Thames, swollen with filth, carried both refuse and corpses. Rats bred in the alleys, their fleas spreading plague that could wipe out households in days. Yet amid this squalor, the court staged masks of dazzling splendor. Courtiers danced in cloth of gold, their collars stiff with pearls, their perfumes attempting to mask the rot outside. This duality, glittering artifice within, grotesque reality without, was the very essence of the Tudor world. The king's wives bore the brunt of his obsessions. After Anne Boleyn's fall, Jane Seymour gave him the son he craved, Edward, but her death in childbed reminded all of the mortal peril that shadowed Tudor women. Accounts of her funeral describe Henry's grief, real or performed, followed swiftly by negotiations for another bride. The marriage to Anne of Cleves was a farce, the king recoiling at her appearance, though some whispered his impotence was to blame. Catherine Howard, young and foolish, danced herself into Henry's affections, but perished when accused of adultery, her screams echoing in the Tower as the axe rose. Catherine Parr, last of his queens, played the nurse, surviving only by wit and caution. Behind the marriages lay the deeper story of dynastic survival. Edward VI, frail from birth, was the fragile hope of the line. His reign, dominated by protectors, drove England deeper into Protestant reform. Priests were forced into new liturgies, stained glass was smashed, and ancient rites abolished. But the boy's health withered, his thin frame succumbing to what some described as consumption, others as slow poisoning. His death at 15 reopened the abyss of succession. Into that abyss stepped Lady Jane Grey, manipulated by powerful families to seize the crown. Barely 17, she ruled for 9 days before Mary, Henry's eldest daughter, claimed her right. Jane's execution was a spectacle of innocence undone. Chronicles tell of her blindfolded hands fumbling for the block, her voice steady even as the axe descended. Her blood baptized the stone, and England recoiled. Mary I's reign reignited old fires. Determined to return England to Catholic obedience, she launched a campaign of burnings that seared her name into memory. Smithfield became a theater of martyrdom, flames rising against the sky as men and women perished chanting psalms. Reports describe the sickening smell of roasting flesh drifting across London, a stench that clung to her image ever after. Her phantom pregnancies, swelling belly that birthed only despair, became a symbol of divine disfavor. She died childless, broken, her throne passing to her sister Elizabeth. Elizabeth's accession was greeted with cautious hope, yet she was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, stained in the eyes of Catholics, and her gender still a liability in a world that trusted kings over queens. She cloaked herself in symbolism, declaring herself wed to her people, cultivating the image of the Virgin Queen. But beneath the mask, the shocking realities endured. To preserve her youth, she layered her face with poisonous white lead, corroding her skin. Her teeth blackened with decay, her wigs concealed thinning hair. Courtiers dared not remark upon it, for her wrath could be swift. Plots coiled around her like serpents. Assassins, Catholic agents, Spanish intrigues, each threatened her throne. Her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, imprisoned for nearly 2 decades, became the center of endless conspiracies. Finally, Elizabeth signed her death warrant, and Mary walked to her execution in 1587, clad in scarlet, the color of martyrdom. The axe fell clumsily, taking 3 strokes to sever her head, and when the headsman lifted it, her wig came away, revealing short gray hair, to the horror of onlookers. Elizabeth endured, guiding England through war and cultural flowering, yet she left no heir. When she died in 1603, the Tudor line ended, extinguished by the very refusal to marry that had sustained her myth. But their legacy remained, woven of blood, spectacle, and contradictions. The shocking truths of the Tudors were not hidden secrets, but daily realities. Kings who reeked of pus yet demanded adoration, queens who perished under accusation, martyrs who burned while crowds wept, physicians who prescribed death as cure, and a people who lived amid filth while dreaming of glory. To study them is to peel back layers of magnificence and find rot beneath. To admire their triumphs is to taste the ashes of their cruelties. The reign of Elizabeth, though remembered in luminous strokes of triumph, was never free of shadow. She inherited not only her father's throne, but the machinery of fear that had grown under the Tudors. Beneath the pageantry of her progresses, beneath the glitter of pearls sewn into gowns heavy as armor, there pulsed a constant tension of faith and treason, of suspicion and conspiracy, of the living haunted by the dead. The Virgin Queen's mask concealed both frailty and cunning, and it was this duality that made her reign enduring, yet perilous. From the first days of her accession, she balanced upon a knife's edge. The kingdom was divided, its people uncertain whether to cleave to Rome or to the new church her father had birthed. Elizabeth chose the path of compromise, outwardly Protestant, but careful not to alienate the Catholic gentry, who still held wealth and influence. Yet the Pope's eventual excommunication of her declared open season on her life. Assassination attempts, plots fueled by Spanish gold, conspiracies whispered in priest holes, all became the rhythm of her rule. To survive, she created a kingdom of spies. Sir Francis Walsingham, her spy master, spun webs across Europe. Letters were intercepted, codes broken, informants planted even in the intimate chambers of her subjects. No word was safe, no prayer private. Those discovered were dragged to the Tower, where interrogators worked with rack and rope until confessions spilled. Executions multiplied, each one a performance meant to remind the realm of the price of dissent. The chroniclers describe men hanged, cut down still living, disemboweled before crowds that gagged at the spectacle yet dared not look away. It was law as theater, terror as governance. And yet, in the same years, a golden culture flourished. The stages of London thundered with words never forgotten. Shakespeare, Marlowe, Spenser, all patronized under her reign. Nobles built theaters, commoners paid a penny to stand in the pit, and for a few hours they escaped the filth of their alleys to watch kings, queens, and fools reflect their own world in heightened verse. But even here shadows lurked. The plague closed the theaters for long months, emptying them of voices and filling the city with silence broken only by the creak of carts carrying the dead. Some said the pestilence was divine punishment for the very plays that mocked kings and gods. The plague was not the only horror stalking her people. Accounts speak of sweating sickness, a mysterious contagion that struck suddenly, killing within hours. Victims shivered with violent chills, then burned with fever, drenched in sweat that poured from their bodies until they collapsed, lifeless. Physicians were helpless, and the terror it spread left whole towns abandoned overnight. In such times, superstition replaced medicine. Charms, amulets, prayers to saints no longer recognized by the crown. Yet the sickness returned in waves, defying cure, reminding all that beneath Elizabeth's radiant court, England was still prey to unseen forces. Daily life offered its own grotesque contrasts. In London, refuse was thrown into the streets, cesspits overflowed, and butchers' stalls left rivers of blood that mixed with sewage. Yet in the halls of Whitehall, tables groaned under the weight of exotic fruits, sugared confections, and meats spiced with imports from across the seas. Nobles blackened their teeth with sugar, a luxury so excessive that it became a status symbol. The Queen herself, fond of sweets, suffered from blackened teeth, and courtiers, eager to flatter, adopted the same decay as a fashion. Beauty was both artifice and poison. Women painted their faces with ceruse, a deadly mixture of white lead and vinegar, to achieve the pale mask of fashion. They plucked their hairlines to elongate their foreheads, stuffed herbs into their bodices to disguise the stench of sweat, and bound their waists with stiffened corsets until their ribs bruised. Elizabeth's own cosmetics hid scars left by smallpox, yet each layer corroded her skin further. Beneath the splendor of her portraits, reality was one of disease masked by ritual. In her court, symbolism was weapon and armor. She appeared before her people as Gloriana, Astrea, the Virgin Queen, touched by divinity. Painters were forbidden to depict her aging, her wrinkles, or her failing body. Portraits were filtered into iconic images, symbols of eternal youth. Yet those who saw her in her final years described thinning hair hidden under wigs, a face caked with paint, and hands trembling with age. The mask was absolute, and the truth was treason to speak aloud. Still, Elizabeth commanded loyalty by words sharper than any sword. At Tilbury in 1588, as the Spanish Armada threatened invasion, she rode among her troops in armor, declaring that, though she had the body of a weak woman, she possessed the heart and stomach of a king. The soldiers cheered, and her words echoed across centuries. The Armada was scattered by storm and fire, and her legend sealed. Yet, behind that legend were sailors starving, fleets rotting, and the corpses of thousands who perished from hunger and disease even after victory. Plots did not cease. The Babington conspiracy, uncovered by Walsingham, ensnared Mary, Queen of Scots. After nearly 2 decades of captivity, Mary was tried and condemned. Her execution was a grotesque spectacle. The executioner's axe struck once, then twice, and still did not sever her head cleanly. When at last it was lifted, her wig came away, revealing grey hair cropped short, and her small dog was found trembling beneath her skirts, drenched in blood. Even her death became an emblem of the brutality and uncertainty of Tudor rule. Elizabeth never married, though suitors circled like vultures. Some whispered she could not bear children, others that she had chosen virginity as a political shield. Rumors abounded of intimacy with Robert Dudley, of secret liaisons, of deformities hidden beneath gowns. Some tales, spun by enemies, claimed she was a man in disguise, her very gender a fabrication to sustain power. The truth was lost amid layers of propaganda and slander, leaving historians to sift shadows. Her court was filled with such ambiguities. Nobles danced in masks that celebrated chastity, while engaging in affairs whispered across Europe. Alchemists promised elixirs of eternal life. Astrologers cast horoscopes for battles and births. Elizabeth herself consulted the stars, though she cloaked such practices in secrecy. Every decision, from war to marriage negotiations, was layered in omens, superstition, and calculated image. The Queen aged, her reign stretching into decades, but she never named an heir. The uncertainty gnawed at her realm. Courtiers plotted, foreign powers watched, and the people wondered what would follow when the mask finally fell. In her last years she grew melancholy, pacing her chambers at night, fingering jewels, muttering of betrayal. Some said the ghosts of the executed haunted her, that the blood of her mother, Anne Boleyn, cried out in her ears. Others believed the loneliness of power had consumed her. When she died in 1603, the legend of Gloriana gave way to the frailty of a woman wasted by age and cosmetics. Her body, once hidden behind armor and pearls, lay pale and cold. With her, the Tudor line expired. The crown passed to James of Scotland, and the age of the Tudors was sealed into memory. But their truths, shocking in every age, lingered. A dynasty born in battlefields and cloaked in roses had ruled by spectacle, terror, and illusion. Beneath their magnificence lay rot, bodies swollen with disease, streets reeking of filth, cures steeped in superstition, marriages drowned in blood. Yet from the same soil bloomed words and images that endure, a paradox of brilliance and brutality that has never released its hold upon imagination. The splendor of Tudor courts has long overshadowed the lives of those who moved in their shadows. Yet it is in the narrow passages and whispered corners that some of the most unsettling truths of the age are found. For while kings and queens postured in painted portraits, their subjects endured a harsher reality. And those who dared the intimacy of royal favor often discovered that proximity to power was nothing less than proximity to death. Among the courtiers of Henry VIII and his heirs, rise and ruin could come with the swiftness of a turning page. The chronicles speak of Thomas Cromwell, architect of the king's supremacy, who dissolved monasteries and filled the royal coffers, only to find himself cast down and beheaded when he arranged a marriage that displeased his sovereign. His fall was as ruthless as his rise. His head, spiked upon London Bridge, looked down on the Thames that had carried the treasures of monasteries only years before. Others, like the Duke of Norfolk, skirted the axe again and again, condemned and reprieved according to the shifting moods of monarchs. The court was a theatre where flattery was armor, suspicion was poison, and survival itself a daily act of performance. Beyond the palace gates, the people bore witness to the machinery of Tudor justice. Punishment was both spectacle and deterrent, calculated to burn its memory into the minds of onlookers. Thieves might be whipped until the skin tore, vagrants branded with hot irons, petty criminals dragged through the streets at the cart's tail. Greater crimes drew punishments more grotesque. Heretics burned, traitors hanged until half dead, their entrails torn out and set aflame before their eyes. Chroniclers do not spare the details, the screams, the smell of burning flesh, the crowd both horrified and compelled. Children were sometimes hoisted upon shoulders to watch, as if terror itself were to be passed down as inheritance. Such cruelty was not mere excess, it was doctrine. Order was maintained by fear, and obedience was measured in blood. A man who spoke too freely in a tavern could find himself before the Star Chamber. A woman accused of witchcraft might be pressed with stones until she confessed. The Tudors ruled not only by law, but by the constant reminder that law was mortal and could shift with the monarch's breath. To live under such a crown was to live with the knowledge that innocence offered no shield. The strangeness of Tudor medicine was another theatre of both hope and horror. Physicians, lacking understanding of infection, prescribed treatments that to modern eyes appear more curse than cure. Toothaches were soothed with mixtures of honey and ground ashes of dogs' teeth. Fevers treated with draughts of vinegar mixed with powdered emerald. Gout relieved by rubbing the skin with roasted owl. Some remedies called for the blood of young animals, others for the fat of the freshly executed. The body was a vessel in which superstition and desperation coexisted, and patients submitted because death was always nearer than healing. Food and drink reflected the same paradox. Nobles consumed sugar in such abundance that their teeth rotted, turning black, a sign of wealth that courtiers imitated by painting their own teeth. The poor, meanwhile, subsisted on rye bread, often moldy, and pottage made of whatever scraps could be boiled into it. Ale was drunk by all, child and adult alike, for water was seldom trusted. The court feasted on swans and venison while the streets starved, and in years of bad harvests the contrast grew unbearable. Rebellions flared, not always political but born of hunger, only to be crushed with merciless ferocity. Beneath the grand designs of monarchs, the common people carried burdens invisible in official chronicles, but preserved in parish records and whispered folk memory. Epidemics could depopulate whole villages. A family might lose half its children in a single season. Women faced endless danger in childbirth, many never surviving to see their children grown. Orphans crowded the streets of London, some pressed into servitude, others left to starve. The crown's concern was not their suffering but their obedience, and laws were passed branding them vagrants and subjecting them to mutilation for wandering in search of bread. Even within the nobility, the Tudor household was not free of dread. Servants lived in fear of scandal, for a misplaced word could become evidence of treason. Ladies-in-waiting witnessed the fall of queens, sometimes dragged down with them. Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, who had once betrayed her own husband and sister-in-law Anne, lived long enough to be caught in Catherine Howard's disgrace, sent to the block by the same machinery of accusation she had once fed. Treachery was a coin passed from hand to hand, and it always exacted its price. The supernatural threaded itself through daily existence. Omens were read in the flight of birds, in comets that streaked across the night sky, in the monstrous births recorded by midwives. A child born with deformity was taken as a sign of divine anger, a judgment upon its parents or the realm. Witches were feared, their supposed charms blamed for miscarriages, storms, or sudden death. Even monarchs did not escape such beliefs. Elizabeth consulted astrologers before making decisions of state, while common folk hung charms of iron or herbs over their doors. The Tudor age was one in which religion, science, and magic were not yet parted, and each lived uneasily beside the others. Executions of the mighty became national theatre. Anne Boleyn's fall, Jane Grey's blindfolded hands, Mary Stuart's botched beheading, each was remembered with a vividness that turned their deaths into legend. Crowds gathered not merely to see justice done, but to carry away the memory of it, repeating details until they became myth. The axe was not just a weapon, but a symbol, binding the living to the dead through the theatre of fear. Children born long after could recite the words spoken on scaffolds, so deeply were they etched into England's memory. The Tudor navy, often remembered for the Armada, also bore its share of horror. The warship Mary Rose, pride of Henry VIII, capsized in battle, drowning hundreds of sailors trapped below decks. When the wreck was later raised, the remains bore witness to cramped lives, bones bent by labor, teeth worn to stumps, and the marks of disease etched deep. Glory at sea was built upon suffering, and the songs of victory could not silence the groans of those lost beneath the waves. And always there was the presence of disease. Plague carts rattled through London, bells tolling for the dead. Houses were marked with painted crosses, whole families sealed inside to die together. Priests ventured to bless them at peril of their lives. Physicians fled. and the poor turned to charms and prayers, whispered at the thresholds of locked doors. The stench of death mingled with the river's filth, and some believed that the very air had turned malevolent. In such a world, the shock is not that superstition flourished, but that hope endured at all. When the Tudor age is recalled, it is often with visions of majesty. The roses of Henry VII, the gluttonous banquets of Henry VIII, the jeweled masks of Elizabeth. Yet beneath those images lie the true contours of their reign. The endless procession of executions, the grotesque punishments inflicted upon the weak, the bizarre medicines that promised relief while delivering poison, the hunger gnawing at the bellies of peasants, the terror that haunted nobles at court. It was a century where magnificence was a veil stretched thin over cruelty, and where every rose carried thorns sharp enough to draw blood. The dynasty endured for little more than a century, yet it reshaped England irrevocably. It forged a nation at once enthralled by spectacle and hardened by fear. And in that crucible, the people learned to live with contradiction, to revere sovereigns who destroyed their churches, to cheer victories won with the bodies of the poor, to admire a queen who wore poison on her skin to project eternal youth. To remember the Tudors honestly is to see both light and darkness entwined, neither canceling the other, both defining the age. The twilight of the Tudors came not with a shattering battle, nor a sudden coup, but with the slow fading of a queen who had ruled longer than any of her forebears. Elizabeth, who had ascended in the brilliance of youth, passed into age while clinging to the mask she had forged. Her courtiers grew old with her, the children of her nobles becoming grey-haired men and women themselves, yet still kneeling before a sovereign who insisted upon the illusion of eternal maidenhood. In her chambers, lit by guttering candles, she walked the nights away, fingering her jewels as though they might speak answers, murmuring to herself of betrayal and destiny. Her body, ravaged by time and poisoned by the cosmetics that had preserved her image, could no longer hide its frailty. Witnesses spoke of her fingers, long and bony, trembling as they clutched the arms of her throne, of her teeth, blackened and broken, of the layers of paint cracking on her face, a mask fissured with age. Yet, she resisted all attempts to place her in her bed, refusing food, standing in silence until exhaustion felled her. To some, this obstinacy was the final performance of Gloriana. To others, it was the terror of a woman who knew that with her death, an entire dynasty would crumble. In those years, rumors swirled like smoke. Some whispered that the queen was tormented by visions of her mother, Anne Boleyn, returning headless from the Tower. Others claimed she muttered the names of men who had once circled her throne: Robert Dudley, Essex, Raleigh, ghosts of passion and betrayal alike. The death of Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, executed after his rebellion, hung over her like a storm cloud. Chroniclers recorded her melancholy, her long silences, her refusal to retire to chambers once filled with music. She stood, as though unwilling to lie down, knowing that lying down meant surrender to the grave. The succession weighed upon the kingdom with crushing uncertainty. Elizabeth had never named an heir, a silence that had allowed her to rule unchallenged, but which threatened to plunge the realm into chaos. Behind closed doors, courtiers maneuvered, their letters whispering the name of James of Scotland, descendant of Margaret Tudor, sister of Henry VIII. The Queen, perhaps resigned, perhaps defeated, gave no open endorsement, though in the last weeks it is said she made a gesture with her fingers, tracing the outline of a crown as she murmured James's name. Whether true or legend, it sufficed. On the 24th of March, 1603, Elizabeth I breathed her last. The Tudor line, born in battle along Bosworth Field, extinguished in the quiet of Richmond Palace, ended with no child to carry it forward. The crown passed to the Stuarts, and the union of England and Scotland began. But though the dynasty was gone, its shadow lengthened, not shortened. For in truth, the Tudors had never been merely rulers. They had been architects of image, masters of theater, sovereigns who ruled by spectacle as much as by sword. Henry VII, whose legitimacy had been uncertain, forged stability by weaving myth around his victory. Henry VIII, whose appetites devoured wives and faith alike, carved himself into memory as the monarch who reshaped the very church. Mary I, remembered for flames that consumed heretics. Elizabeth, who turned virginity into empire. Each left behind not just laws and treaties, but an afterimage, an icon, a mask that endures centuries after their bones turned to dust. Yet the shocking truths persist beneath the masks. Henry VIII, the Golden Prince, stank of rotting ulcers, carried in contraptions because his body could no longer bear his weight. Anne Boleyn, remembered as a temptress or martyr, died under charges many scholars believe fabricated, a victim of her husband's desperation for a son. Jane Seymour's body was consumed by childbirth. Catherine Howard screamed in her youth. Catherine Parr survived, but lived in fear that her own learning might condemn her. Edward VI, hailed as the Protestant hope, died in agony at 15. Mary I's womb swelled with false pregnancies that mocked her prayers for an heir. Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, covered her face with poison to hide the ravages of smallpox and time. Beyond the throne, the people lived in a world no less grim. Filth filled the streets. Plague carts rolled. Executions entertained as much as they terrified. Physicians bled their patients until they fainted, applied poultices of dung, and prescribed charms of bone and blood. Hunger gnawed at the poor, while nobles gnawed sugar-encrusted meats. Belief in omens ruled decisions. A comet might halt a marriage, a deformed birth might doom a policy. The Tudors lived in a realm where superstition, politics, and bloodshed danced inseparably together. And still, from that mire rose splendor. Shakespeare's plays thundered across wooden stages. Explorers carried England's flag to seas uncharted. Poets gilded the language. Portraitists immortalized faces already caked with paint. The paradox of the Tudors is not merely that they shocked in their cruelty, but that they dazzled in their magnificence. The same dynasty that burned heretics also fostered art that has never died. The same monarch who signed death warrants also strummed a lute. The same queen who painted herself as eternal maiden knew the loneliness of age. The legacy left behind is not easily measured in victories or statutes. It lingers in the English imagination, in the fascination with their marriages, their scandals, their grotesque habits, their triumphs. Every century since has looked back, half in horror, half in admiration, seeing in the Tudors both the mirror of human frailty and the mask of human ambition. Their secrets, whispered in chronicles, debated in halls of learning, retold in fireside tales, remain inexhaustible. The dynasty lasted little more than a century, but it remade a kingdom. It broke from Rome and forged a church. It survived rebellions and plots. It cast queens into prisons and onto scaffolds. It sent fleets to sea and watched them sink. It crowned children and saw them die. It raised women to power in an age that distrusted them, only to see those women wield authority with a ferocity that reshaped Europe. Above all, it left behind a tapestry woven of contradiction, cruelty and brilliance, superstition and art, terror and triumph. To open the pages of their story is to inhale the stench of blood and roses together. It is to see Henry, once radiant, grown monstrous. To hear Anne Boleyn's final words before the blade. To smell the smoke of Smithfield as martyrs burned. To taste sugar on Elizabeth's blackened teeth. To feel the hush of crowds watching Jane Grey's blindfolded hands. It is to understand that the Tudors were not myths, but flesh, and that flesh was fragile, corruptible, and mortal. When the vault closes on their century, what remains is neither pure horror nor pure glory, but a fascination that refuses to die. The Tudors haunt because they embody extremes. Power seized and squandered, bodies worshipped and destroyed, faith exalted and betrayed. They are both warning and wonder, proof of how high and how low human ambition can drive a people. And so, 500 years on, their ghosts still walk. They walk in the echo of Shakespeare's verse, in the stern walls of Hampton Court, in the stones of the Tower of London where whispers never fade. They walk in every tale retold of Henry's wives, of Mary's flames, of Elizabeth's mask. To hear their story is to unroll a scroll inked with both blood and gold, to read not only the record of kings and queens, but the testament of what it means to be human, magnificent and monstrous all at once. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.